Trump settles into global affairs. Russia, saving face and seeking revenge. And finally, the drone fiasco enraging America. This and more coming right up. This is the Dangerous Waters podcast, where we dive deep into dangerous waters. I'm your host, Alex, and today we have a myriad of news topics. Let's get straight into it. Our first topic of the day is Trump settling into his role as president-elect and eventually president, and seeking to carve out his own niche in the global affairs space, providing opinions here and there. Really interesting stuff, especially when it comes to Ukraine and Iran, new statements coming out from Trump. The implications of these statements, before we get into it, it really shows that Trump is sort of conflicted. He says different rhetoric to different people at different times, and it's not consistent. Before the election, and also even somewhat after the election, he wanted to maintain the image that when going into negotiations with Ukraine, that he would be a strongman, that he would be very powerfully aligned with Zelensky, with Ukraine, and his cabinet picks also show this as well. But ultimately, the goal of this is not to support Ukraine to the bitter end. It's to get both Ukraine and Russia to the negotiating table. If he can make Zelensky and Ukraine believe that he is for their interests, they are more likely to accept a deal and talk with the Russian side, knowing that Trump is backing them and protecting them. For Russia, they also have the incentive, if Trump is acting like a peace through strength, strongman type figure, who knows what he could do to Russia. He could fund the living hell out of Ukraine. He could, according to what Trump told Putin during his first presidency, bomb the hell out of Moscow. These are threats that Trump has made, that Trump can make, that genuinely do strike fear into Russia, because they know that Trump is not a figure that is controlled, that can be messed with. He has a mind of his own, and what he says may actually happen. However, recently Trump came out with a new statement during a Time Person of the Year interview. Trump actually just became 2024's Time Person of the Year, but in this interview, he says, quote, "It's crazy what's taking place, it's crazy. I disagree very vehemently with sending missiles hundreds of miles into Russia. Why are we doing that? We're just escalating this war and making it worse. That should not have been allowed to be done," yada, yada, yada. But he calls it a very big mistake towards the end as well. But this goes against Trump's strongman philosophy. In fact, what this message shows is that for Ukraine, they're doing something wrong. They can't defend themselves. They need to, be forced to come to the negotiating table, because Trump really is the largest military backer of them, but not under favorable terms. So sort of the opposite of what Ukraine has expected going into this process. Meanwhile, at the same time, Russia is now thinking, after this statement, well, this is great because we've been saying this the whole time. The U.S. should never have launched long-range missiles into Russia. And now, because of this, maybe Trump and we are on the same side, and we could come to terms with a good deal that are favorable to Russia. So maybe Trump wants to play both sides, but if he wants favorable conditions for the U.S. and also for Ukraine and for a stronger West, this is not the kind of rhetoric that he should be putting out. But the fact that he is putting this out does show that I think ultimately this is his true mindset. The strongman talk obviously is just a facade. It's there to threaten other enemies, but really his opinion on this issue is that statement right there. He wants the war to end at any means. He doesn't want this thing to continue anymore. Just countless lives being lost, and he's been talking about this as well. The 400,000 casualties, the 600,000 casualties. He just needs this thing finished. And I think sometimes if he becomes a little bit impatient he will forget about that image and he will just kind of say whatever's on his mind, this being exactly that. And now with the globally unstable situation going on in Syria as well as the Middle East, we have a massive, massive conflict ideologically, militarily between Israel and Iran. Trump has also, his team weighed in on this issue somewhat, in which they are now considering sending a U.S. military involvement to help Israel destroy Iranian nuclear sites. This is a massive topic and really of pivotal importance to the interests of not just Israel, but also the West, hoping that we don't get another nuclear power, especially one like Iran. When you have nuclear status, what that means is that you now have an immense amount of fear and respect as a nation, as one of the only countries in the world that has this type of capability. And obviously you can't be as aggressive against countries with nuclear weapons anymore because of the fear of mutually assured destruction. That is, if you attack them, they may retaliate with nukes, and then both sides end up destroying themselves in that process. This is really, really big, though, coming from Trump, with the potential involvement of the U.S. military in striking down Iranian nuclear sites. And this comes at a time where it does make sense to consider a proposal such as this, because Israel has just wiped out Hamas, Hezbollah. They have pretty much destroyed the vast majority of Assad's former military, including most advanced air defense systems that could have impeded Israeli offensives into Iran through the Air Force. So right now, Israel and right now the United States are at a very strong position to potentially perform such an action, especially considering the weakness of the Iranian regime at the moment, with their allies being destroyed and with their proxy networks crumbling one by one. Really, strategically speaking, there isn't really a better opportunity to be doing this, and if they don't do something now, it might be too late in the future. We also have new updates on the Russia-Ukraine situation. Recently, Ukraine launched U.S.-supplied ATACMS missiles, which have they're long-range ballistic missiles. They've been sent into Russia, and Russia is now in a position where their deterrence has effectively failed. The most recent time before yesterday that Ukraine launched ATACMS missiles into Russia, Russia almost immediately retaliated by conducting a Oreshnik missile test. This is a new missile with really unknown specifications from the Russian side, but they claim that it can be nuclear armed, except this time it was using a kinetic payload, so there was no nuclear damage involved. But Russia used this as a hope of deterring Ukraine from future attacks on their territory using these American-supplied missiles. But we can see that's not the case. Ukraine recently used them again in Russian lands, and Russia is now in a position where they want to retaliate. They want to send a message to Ukraine, but they know that nothing is really going to work. Ukraine is emboldened in a new way. They have really desperate measures being taken. They will do anything they can to survive, but that only involves continuing the war and trying to actually militarily drive Russia out of Ukraine. Right now, they are not really too warm toward diplomatic negotiations, considering the gravity of the war and already the amount that they've had to put into this conflict. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens next. But Russia recently retaliated somewhat by launching a massive missile and drone strike into Ukrainian lands. This involved over 81 missiles, 200 drones, roughly $1 billion in USD or more of resources being launched into Ukraine, targeting the energy sector. We've seen this before in previous years. This is really just a repeat of Russian tactics, trying to energy starve Ukraine and destroy the population's morale and hope that they will want to come to the negotiating table, knowing that they won't have strong enough electricity supply, energy supply for their daily lives. This technique has not worked in the past. It probably will continue to not work. So this is really more of a symbolic message at this point, telling the Ukrainians that, look, we still have a lot of power here. We still hold the upper hand militarily. Let's do something about that. Shifting our focus to domestic news, we have a drone fiasco in raging America. This has been an ongoing issue for the past few days, where people have been seeing unknown unmanned aerial vehicles flying around the area, around military bases, and there have been so much commotion and a lot of nonsense related to this event. And it doesn't help that the federal government has not been issuing adequate responses satisfying the public's interest. We've seen John Kirby come out and say that these are not foreign in origin, but we've also seen people like Representative Jeff Van Drew of New Jersey saying that this is actually conducted by a foreign government. It was Iran. They have a mothership of drones, and they are really directing all of the activity that's going on. So all sorts of conflicting information. What's really going on? I personally believe that these are American in origin, these drones. They are probably being tested under some sort of secret government program, either to conduct some military exercise. It could also be a PSYOP campaign just to gauge the American public's interest into events like this. How much can we capture the scene, the narrative, the focus of the news, and all sorts of possibilities, but I do not believe this is Iranian or Chinese or Russian in origin. It simply doesn't make sense. We also had a new Inspector General report from the Department of Justice come out and give more clarifying details on federal involvement in the January 6th protests. This is a pretty interesting perspective because there have been conflicting headlines coming out about this event. The mainstream media says no spies involved, no FBI agents were involved in the January 6th events that happened. But other news will say, if you look closer at the report, 26 confidential human informants, CHIs, were involved. So now we have to take a look at what is the difference between an agent and a confidential human informant or a confidential informant. An agent is someone who is directly employed by the FBI. They work under the FBI jurisdiction. Their entire occupation is within FBI. Everything they do is under the FBI mission. Whereas confidential human informants, on the other hand, don't work directly for the FBI, but they are used by the FBI to reliably gain information about certain events. A lot of times you'll see that informants come from criminal cases in which people who have been convicted of crimes may have lower sentences if they cooperate with the FBI and provide information to them. Other times it could just be civilians who happen to stumble upon a lot of information. But either way, in order to become an FBI confidential human informant, you have to go through a rigorous process by the FBI. And in that case, you are essentially working on behalf of FBI interests, even if you're not directly employed. So this news that there have been 4 CHIs that entered into the Capitol during the rioting process is quite big, and people have been using this as a way to say, oh, look, the FBI, the feds, they're behind this. Ultimately, this doesn't really clear up the full extent of what's going on. I believe there is more information that is probably classified. But ultimately, what happened on January 6th is a massive combination of all sorts of inadequacies coming in from the Capitol Police, from the DC mayor. Even Nancy Pelosi herself has said that this is her responsibility, what happened that night. So the extent goes far beyond whether or not there were FBI informants in the scene. No matter what, this was just a colossal failure of law enforcement, of the federal government, in ensuring that this kind of event, which was well recorded and well known to be taking place with this kind of attendance would not spiral out of control. In other news, Amazon just announced that they will also be donating $1 million to Trump's inaugural fund, this coming right after Mark Zuckerberg announced a donation, clearly showing that Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos are seeing the prospects of a potential success in the Trump administration, and they want to be a part of it. They want to secure their interests in a quid pro quo fashion. Let's get into some rapid fire news. We have India and Russia, which recently just announced a deeper partnership, with India now purchasing $13 billion worth of Russian oil every year, as well as resuming the licensed production of Russian Su-30 fighter jets. Also, Russia has been desperately scrambling to work with Turkey and with the HTS to ensure military access to their remaining infrastructure in Syria, although talks have not finalized on that front. We also have the US, which successfully tested a ground-launched hypersonic missile platform amid a litany of failures over the years. $500 million of aid was also announced by the Department of Defense being sent to Ukraine. Finally, Chinese President Xi appears to have declined Trump's invitation to his inauguration. With that being said, if you enjoyed today's episode, please make sure to like, subscribe, and comment, and I'll see you all in the next one.